Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to another episode of the Eon Podcast. We have with us today Brother Subboor Ahmad. You guys have seen him online debating all sorts of colorful atheists. We have him finally in studio, and I would like to let the people know that he is also a kinsman, North Punjabi, Potowari speaking. Subboor bhai, how are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, how are you doing?
How's your trip been back home?
Alhamdulillah, home's home.
Home is home, mashallah. Glad to hear. Just for the audience who don't know Subboor bhai is technically a civil engineer from the University of, from City University, but he did his master's in philosophy from the University of Birkbeck, right? And his main focus is on the philosophy of biology, as well as the general new atheism movement. You have a certain amount of expertise in that subject.
Yeah.
Now, growing up in the UK, in the Western world, during the war on terror, I think specifically in a post 9/11 sort of reality, Iraq and Afghanistan faced the military brunt of it, and then the surrounding regions. Pakistan also faced a certain amount of it, and Iran. But I think in terms of the cultural warfare that was engaged in by the West, I think Western Muslims were at the front line, at least in the belly of the beast. Now that you're 30-something, mashallah, what was that like growing up with that? And then how did that form your ideas about religion? And now you've ended up as a professional polemic style debater. How did that influence that journey?
That's an interesting question to begin with. So, alhamdulillah, you know, when you come from a background with a country like Pakistan or India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, wherever you go in the world, you're always going to have that Islamic identity, even if you're not praying. You'll have some form of a strong Islamic identity. So I had the Islamic identity, and then when the war on terror started, right? Actually, even before it started, Tuesday, I believe it was Tuesday, September the 11th, when the attack took place. The very next day, I had a sociology class, my first class, when I was around, I think, 16. And this is when I was studying in Oxford. So it was Cherwell College. And we basically had this sociology class in another college. So the very first day of my sociology class was the first day of term, and it was the 12th of September. And all the newspapers were about the Muslims and the terrorists and, you know, all this stuff. And I decided there and then to quit sociology. You're a teenager, you're impressionable, you're young, you're going to be, you know, you're looking at everybody looking at you as a, you know, as a person who's a Muslim, right? So it's just something that we all felt when we were growing up in that era. And remember, this was the time in which it was acceptable. It was acceptable to be coming up with this sort of anti-Islamic rhetoric, loads and loads of people getting stopped on Section 7 of the UK terrorism law, whatever it's called. And it was very much like in that movement, we saw, in terms of the media, a full frontal attack on Islam, not only from a perspective of, look at these Muslims, they're evil, but also from an ideological perspective. And that's the rise of new atheism that we grew up with, right? So the likes of Christopher Hitchens, you know, being a cheerleader for the Iraq war, and then saying, you know, the ones who are fighting for secularism is us, as in the new atheists, and the American army. Like, just consider that for a second, that you're being told ideologically the West is at war with Islam, and new atheists are the ones fighting Islam ideologically. And at that time, we had the very popular debates happening between new atheists and theists and all of these things happening. So I would say that aspect of the early 21st century, it will be studied by historians as a period of ideological divergence in terms of where people form their worldviews. And I think where I fell into that is I just went full in terms of, I'm a Muslim, I have to be a proud Muslim. We Muslims have a identity, we have a history, and that keeps you within Islam, even if you don't know the basics of Islam. I think this is why I'm very much in favor of this term, Islam Pasand. So there may be somebody who's a total ignoramus when it comes to the basics of Islam, but they say, I am Muslim, right? And that keeps them within Islam until they obviously find the spiritual sweetness.
No, inshallah, then we hope that all of our brothers and sisters who are in that sort of tribal state of Islam where Allah is the sort of the local tribal god and we have a certain way of doing things and even if it is in the minimum an identity, it's not nothing. And that eventually, as you said, when they taste the sweetness of Iman, for a lot of them can become something much more, hopefully, inshallah. Yeah. And so now you've come full circle and you've written 2 books. One of them is being published this year,
published by Sapiens, yeah.
By Sapiens Institute, the classic. It's called The Death of Neo-Darwinism.
Yeah.
And we're going to be seeing this year, inshallah.
Yes.
And next year, you're going to be coming out with...
So next year's book is called Dawkins Deselected.
Yeah, it's pretty...
Deselected.
I think it's an appropriately titled book.
Just to add, the subtitle of that book is The Death of New Atheism.
The Death of New Atheism, right.
Yeah.
And so since you've focused on New Atheism, Darwinism or Neo-Darwinism, can you give us, the audience, a brief history of how we've arrived at this point? Because I think 9/11 is, you're smack in the middle of it. But clearly Western civilization, Western academics, Western media was prepared for it. There's been a century or 2 of pre-work that has been done in targeting Islam or theism in general.
Absolutely.
As the opponent.
No, absolutely. I mean, look, let's go back to this very interesting period, which is the Victorian 19th century. So in this period, and this is one of the things that I've focused on in terms of my second book, Dawkins Deselected, what you find is Darwin was not anybody who you could describe as a new atheist or of that type of thinking. He was a theist, then he became a deist. So he believed in God when he published The Origin of Species. He believed in God for the majority of his life. His agnosticism came because of the problem of evil in the last decade of his life. That's what we know. So what we have here is a very complex character, and the way that one academic described it is we shouldn't pigeonhole someone that doesn't pigeonhole pigeons. Right? So, everybody wants to claim him. And this is one of the things I wanted to do in my next book, to show that Dawkins has misrepresented Darwin, right?
To a large majority of us, including
to a large
myself.
majority of us. And Dawkins has not only misrepresented Darwin from the perspective of his belief in God, from the perspective of what is the implications of evolutionary theory, it's also in terms of his own theory. So one of the interesting things is that Darwin would never have been a neo-Darwinist. And for a lot of people, that just doesn't make any sense. And we're going to get into what neo-Darwinism is shortly, inshallah. But what we have to keep in mind is that we have to look at the history in order to understand today. So if you want to understand how do we get to Christopher Hitchens speaking about, fighting Islam ideologically and the new atheists being at the forefront and the American army doing that in Iraq and Afghanistan, that kind of rhetoric, where does it begin off? It doesn't just begin off, like you said, in the beginning of the 21st century. It goes back a long time. And, the Orientalist view of Muslims is obviously linked to that. So what we find is that Darwin was obviously misrepresented, and Darwin's theory was used to push a type of hard atheism, right? And this was something that we can see in his writings, would have disagreed with. So the first time I properly understood this was a few years back when I was preparing for a discussion between myself and Professor Jeremy Pritchard at Birmingham University. So he's an atheist, and he's a evolutionary academic in his own right. And the discussion was, does evolution undermine God? Right? Now, in this discussion, I thought, okay, let me bring out some historical aspect to this. So I largely use Nick Spencer's book, Darwin and God. And in this book, what we find is that Darwin is talking about the fact that you can be an ardent atheist and be an evolutionist. Some very interesting historical aspects as well, where one of his friends wrote him a letter in which, after he published The Origin of Species, he said that his friend said, well, if God created one form of life and then that one form of life evolved into all the life that we have today, or God created many different forms of life independently, which is the creationist view.
Yeah.
Both of those views do not take away from God's greatness or nobility. Something of this like. Darwin was so impressed by those words that he took them from his friend's letter and he inserted them in this second edition of The Origin of Species. Does that sound like a new atheist to you?
No.
So clearly we have somebody who's thinking in a way that's much more broader than the way that
he's presented to be.
The epistemically blinkered view that new atheists try and push. So in that discussion as well, Pritchard, like myself, he pointed out, actually, no, you can believe in God and you can believe in evolution. There's no problem here. What does that do? It takes away from the main argument of the God delusion. And the main argument of the God delusion is basically the argument that since biological design is explained away by natural selection, therefore we can infer any physical design can also be explained away by a similar type of naturalistic process. God almost certainly doesn't exist. That's the crude argument that he basically came up with. And that's the crude argument that something you pointed out before we started this podcast, that in Pakistan and countries like this, the secularists, the liberals, and the Ataturkists, or whatever you want to call them. Neo-Kemalists, right? These people, it's almost like passive smoking, right? I mean, they're not enjoying the cigarette themselves. They're kind of just smelling around what other people have been smoking, and they regurgitate it in an incoherent way. So the point of writing that book and showing what Dawkins actually did from a philosophical perspective is to totally discredit them and to show that actually this movement, it's not just that they had a point which they were trying to make, it's that they never had a point to begin with, at least theologically. So one of the things that I did in that book is I showed how Dawkins himself understood that evolution does not undermine God. And there's an interview which many people don't know of, and I've cited that interview in the book, in which he's having a discussion with Lawrence Krauss, and he says to Lawrence that, I know that you can believe in God and evolution, but the perception that exists in society is you have to be an atheist to believe in evolution. Since it's my objective to kill religion, all I need to do is to prove to people that evolution is true, and they become into atheists, and I basically achieve my objective of getting rid of religion. That's manipulation. That's being disingenuous. That's basically feeding off the ignorance of people, which is, interestingly, the very claim they make about us.
About religion, yeah.
Yeah. So what I wanted to do with that book is to show these people are not to be trusted.
Are equally as disingenuous as us.
Another thing very interesting I did cover in that book, and I think this is something we should cover because in our neck of the woods, this ideology played a big role and still exists today, which is the Marxist ideology. Because the state atheism of the Marxist states is something which impacted the Muslim world disproportionately.
Yes.
And it's something which we have, to some extent, forgotten.
We have an amnesia about it, yes.
Absolutely. And so when I'm dealing with, for example, Marxists here, it's something I want to point out. And I have pointed out that you can't ignore the blood. You know, if you have your red, right, the red color for these Marxists.
It's full of Central Asian blood.
Yeah. It is absolutely.
Central Asian and Circassian blood.
And to a large degree, state atheism as a project is something which new atheism would have applied if they had power. They just didn't have power. So the ideology is no different. So that's one of the things I cover in the book, that state atheism of the Soviet Union and these types of worldviews is something which is a logical implication of a atheist perspective. Now, before our discussion, I was referring to you to a King's College London study in which an academic panel made up of a Christian, an agnostic, and there was another person with a diverse background.
And they all walked into a bar.
They walked into an academic paper in which they basically argued, and this is very interesting, it's a logical implication that if religion is evil, if you have a consequentialist worldview, then it's a moral obligation to get rid of that religion by peaceful or other means.
Right.
So these people claiming, oh, we're new atheists and we believe in rainbows, we believe in unicorns, we believe in stars and all of this, and everyone's happy and we're all getting along. Actually, no, it's a moral duty, it's an imperative to wipe religion off the face of the earth if you believe, consequentially, that's better in terms of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain.
And said wiping out, for the sake of the audience, would include the religious people as well.
No, they would be the first ones to go. Yeah. Which is what the Soviets did.
Yes.
So what's interesting...
And the Chinese.
And the Chinese. And this is, you know, you were referring earlier to my discussion with O'Connor, right? Alex O'Connor. And this is something I wanted to bring up as well. When it comes to atheists and human rights. They speak about human rights as if human rights were not discussed before they came. And they speak about human rights as if they have a special moral status that others don't have.
In abstraction and in a vacuum, as if the idea of universal human rights are unique to the atheist project. Yes, they do.
However, what we find is that they cannot justify those rights, right?
Because it has no metaphysical grounding.
No, absolutely. And not only is it that they cannot justify those rights, their history has shown that when they did have political power, there was massacres, not only of, say, people through engineered famines, but also through the state oppression, the state atheism that was being applied.
So here, the Western style new atheist movement would argue that we are a different kind of atheism. It's a more pluralistic kind of atheism. Their argument is that you're strawmanning them by presenting them as the state atheism of the Soviet Union and of communist China. This is what they would argue. This is what their pushback would be, that this is a separate strand, and they would use the delineation of the East and West between the Western civilization and the Eastern, more communist Russia or Soviet Russia and communist China. Do you think that's a fair distinction, or do you think
that's an excellent question?
They're one and the same.
That's an excellent question, but there's nothing new under the sun. What we could do is we could look at this from two different perspectives. We can look at it conceptually and historically. Historically, what happened during the French Revolution? That was a secularist movement within the Judeo-Christian Western world.
Right.
Nothing to do with the Eastern barbarians.
Nice.
What did the Jacobites do?
Slaughtered
and killed, and you had blood in the streets, right? So historically, we know that can't be made as a case.
And you would characterize them as a proto-secularist or new atheist type movement?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they applied state atheism, clearly.
In their own way.
Yeah. And this is why they were, considered godless, the first godless nation, right, in Western Europe. But also, if we look at it ideologically, conceptually, why would it not make sense that if religion poisons everything, that's not our narrative, that's their narrative. If religion is the enemy of reason, if religion has done what they're claiming, which is brought upon the earth nothing but destruction and pain, why wouldn't you, from a consequentialist perspective, want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain by getting rid of religion? Why wouldn't you do that? It would be a moral obligation to do that, unless you don't believe in consequentialism. So here they're stuck in between a rock and a hard place. Either you're a consequentialist and you believe in human rights being universalized and you believe in these types of things, or you believe in a non-interventionist worldview in which you just talk abstractly about these rights, but you don't actually want to apply them to people.
I think they would argue that they follow something in between, where they would violently defend their societies and whatever, let's say, when they're localizing themselves to Western civilization, they would argue that we would fight with violence our right to maintain the kind of social freedoms and civil liberties that we enjoy, but we wouldn't want to impose it. They would have a non-interventionist sort of attitude towards the Eastern barbarism. Fine,
but then they would have to justify why they would make that exceptional case, because their worldview doesn't allow it. Their worldview is universal, right? Their worldview is that of consequentialism, which involves all human beings. And secondly, if that is the case, then why would one of their leaders, alongside others, in not just one discussion, we're here talking about Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens in particular, why would they openly endorse an ideological war on Islam, right, using Western military already being in the Muslim world as a pretext to explain to people about how we are basically fighting these people ideologically while the Americans are fighting these people physically, and being quite opportunistic about taking on this taking on the beast of Islam? Why would there be a comparison between Islam and Nazism? Okay, what's the point of Richard Dawkins saying Islam is like Nazism, right? And then when someone challenges him on that and says, well, have you read the Quran? He's like, well, I don't need to read Mein Kampf to know that Nazism is wrong. Why would these statements come out unless you do believe in the neocon project, unless you do believe in the white man's burden. Look, what we have to keep in mind is that they can say whatever they want.
So either they would be ideologically inconsistent or hypocrites. There's no third option.
No, obviously, yeah.
If they didn't apply this if they didn't follow through with consequentialism, then they would be ideologically inconsistent. But because they are following through with it, they're hypocrites, because it's not a cosmopolitan sort of project. It is a white European project. So that's how you're framing this argument.
Yeah, I mean, overall, what we have to keep in mind is, if you make an uncomfortable bed, then you're going to have to lie in it. So if you're going to say, actually, we have an imperial faith, right? So as Muslims, Shabir Akhtar's famous book, Islam as a political, imperialistic faith, we're very clear. Islam is an imperial religion. Islam is something which we want to, as Muslims, ideologically speak to people, convince people, talk to people about this. Historically, we know that Muslim empires existed and they expanded. We're not in a deluded state about that.
We're not lying about it.
Yeah, we're not lying about that. Okay, what did the Ottomans do? Went around and conquered. That's what everybody did. What did the Abbasids do? What did the Umayyads do? We're clear about this. Why is it that when we say to the atheists, well, you would have done the same thing when you had that particular...
And when you have had...
You did that. Yeah. What did the Jacobites do? They did that. What did...
the Soviets do?
What did the... Okay, let's just look at a particular episode. What did the Muslim world suffer at their hands in, say, Yemen, right? Communist Yemen. That type of state atheism being applied, that type of mockery of Islam being applied, the same thing happening in Central Asia, the same thing happening in other parts of the world. When they have power, what it kind of reminds me of, and this is why I'm smiling at this, when we have these Orientalists who say, oh, these Muslims, right? They're just going through their Medinan period. They're weak right now. Sorry, they're going through the Meccan period. They're weak right now. And that's why they're being, passive and nice. But when they're in their Madani period, that's when they have power and energy and they're going to control it. Well, we can say to the atheists, well, that trope we're going to use against you. You're going through your Meccan period right now because you don't have power. And since you don't have power, you're shutting your mouth and you're pretending and talking about rabbits and human rights and unicorns, when in reality, if you did have power, we know what you would do. Why is Sam Harris talking about a preemptive nuclear strike on the Muslim world?
Yes, he has.
And then when someone challenged him on this, he said, somebody challenged him on this, right? And said, well, even if you did believe in a preemptive nuclear strike on the Muslim world, what's the point of blurting that out publicly? Because wouldn't that almost create a self-fulfilling prophecy where the Muslim world is going to try and become more aggravated and more aggressive, get nuclear weapons and so on and so forth, that line of argument. And then Sam Harris turns around and says, well, that's an interesting question in game theory. Well, it's not game theory, bruv. You're saying this publicly, right? You're talking about making the conditions of Muslims worse across the Western world to make it more difficult for Muslims to enter. So what we have to keep in mind is, if you are going to subscribe to a new atheist perspective, then at least own it. We're Muslims. We're proud of being Muslims. We're proud of saying La ilaha illallah. We're proud of every aspect of being a Muslim.
Sam Harris described us as a spiritual 007 kind of character, a James Bond character.
And that's why he said certain characters are...
we're armed with a great spiritual burden, and we have the weapons and the equipment. So he called us a macho religion. I don't know, was it something like macho or alpha or something really very beta of him. Something very beta.
You feel like you're on a mission. You feel like, it's really interesting. Just on a nice little not segue, I guess it's a bit of a detour.
As an aside,
but I want to go on this tangent a little bit about the macho-ness aspect to Islam, right? We were at Oxford University a few years ago, and myself, Hijab, Abdullah Andalusi, a few others, they had the debate, the 2-on-2. Afterwards, we were just discussing stuff. So one of the Oxford University students that was there, he was an atheist. But he said something very perceptive. And I thought, you know what, this is very interesting. He said, if I was to go back to religion, I would go back to Christianity because that's the religion of my ancestors, right? But he said something interesting. He said, Islam, it attracts the young. And he had this type of jealousy that, with Christianity, it's like, seen as the religion of old people and stuff. But with Islam, you see the young. Now, why I want to bring that to this discussion is because I've seen myself, because I'm involved in giving dawah in the streets of London. I've seen that Islam has that image in people's minds. Islam is seen as that rebellious underdog, that counterculture. And what's interesting is in London's subculture of like the black community, right? There's a huge interest in Islam. You go to places like Peckham, you go to Lewisham, you go to Harlesden, my area, so many Jamaican converts, so many converts from the African continent. And there is this thing that Islam's a macho religion, Islam is this, Islam is that. And, while we have, people being confused about their gender, right? People look at Muslims and they're like, well, they have a nuclear family, they have this, they have that. I remember in Speaker's Corner, there was a non-Muslim, and back in those days, the discussions were maybe better without all the cameras. There's this non-Muslim speaker, and he was standing up and he was talking. He said, look, say what you want about the Muslims. He himself was like a Marxist, right? Say whatever you want about the Muslims, but they have a nuclear family. You have the woman who knows what she needs to do. You have the man who knows what he needs to do. You have the children who are respectable, right? I mean, the very fact that they can't mock Islam the way that they can get away with mocking others, it makes people think, do you know what? There's a certain level of backbone these people have, and that attracts people. Even people, I'll tell you something interesting, people who do not like us, they still respect the fact that we have principles, we stick to those principles, and we die on those hills. We're not willing to budge.
No.
And this is why they have a huge fear of Islam.
Which is why they see us as such an opponent. Because we were not only ideologically fighting back, we were physically fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. So that was something that we were tough nut to crack, I think.
From their perspective, they just wanted, I'm talking about the new atheists here, they just wanted Muslims to be good little pets. Back in the Victorian era, during the British Raj, we had these rebellious Maulvis who were, in their madrasas, and they're not being civilized, and they're not, becoming sirs, and they're not becoming the brown sahibs. Today we say Gora complex, back then used to be the brown sahib, yeah? So they're just confused. Why won't these people conform? Why won't these people assimilate?
Which is where the Orientalist sort of notion of good religion and bad religion comes from.
And
right.
The other thing which they find very hard, and I think there's a deliberate effort to not only paint the Muslims as extremists in the West, but a deliberate effort to almost engineer that. Because one thing they find very, very difficult is, why are these people living here in our lands and they're not breaking the laws? They're not committing acts of mass terror in the way that they've predicted that we should have done. Like, take a city like London, 15% of London's Muslim, right? Almost over 30% of the London food businesses are owned by Muslims, right? Yet, where do we find the stabbings and the killings and, the gun crime and all this? You find this, you find this in different communities based upon socioeconomic conditions. It's not to do with religion. They find these things very hard to explain, right? So as Muslims, when we have authentic Islam there, they see it as a threat, because the way that they see it is growing within the West and is undermining the West and is doing this and is doing that. When, for the large part, the vast majority of Muslims, they're not thinking about takeover. They're just thinking about takeaways. They're thinking about running their businesses and restaurants like you were talking about, just living a good life, just traveling and doing this type of thing. But from their perspective, we're supposed to be the savages, but we're not acting like savages. And now, in fact, there's a growing amount of Muslim academics in the Western world, right? And again, that's something they find hard to explain. Your religion is so backwards, it's anti-science, it's this and that. But now we're seeing in so many universities, top universities in the UK, in STEM subjects, you find Muslims doing really well. You find them at university posts. And all of this is the exact opposite of the predictions that they made about the barbarians living within their borders.
Right, because the Turk or the Arab is not just is the barbarian at the gates. He's your doctor now. He's your physician. He's your GP. Right. So we've jumped ahead of ourselves in certain ways. We need you to lay down the sort of history of the transition from Darwinism, logical positivism, and then smack into new atheism, because we mentioned earlier that there was a lot of groundwork that had been laid in the past 18th, 19th, 20th century for there to be such an eruption of new atheism in the 21st. With Islam being the sort of central opponent, or where all the energies were focused. Because the rest of the world has some forms of theism, but let's be honest, the only real theistic sort of opponent left in the world for the new atheist project is Islam. So the groundwork, we started with Darwin.
That's a good way. That's a good way of putting it. So how we start off with the groundwork? Well, the way I guess we can begin is, you can think of the rise of secularism in the Victorian times as a boxer, and that boxer decides, hey, look, there's a old white-haired middle-aged sort of man. I'm the youthful person. Give them a few punches, and then you keep giving them a few jabs for a few centuries. You turn around and you see another boxer. That's a religion. We dealt with Christianity. Oh, we got Islam there. Let's take it out. You take one punch and, it blocks it, and it gives you a punch, and you start to think, wait, there's a challenge. So how did we get from destroying religion so easily from their perspective in the 19th and 20th century to now a religion that's just refusing to submit? Well, in the 19th century, Darwinism was one of the things that was being used to challenge traditional religion, right?
And in this case, it would have been Christianity.
Christianity, yeah. And what we found is that there was a rise in methodological naturalism, right? Methodological naturalism is the idea that in science, we are not going to make a reference to anything that is immaterial, that is non-physical. Every single thing which is supernatural, consciousness, the soul, the immaterial mind, existence of angels, gods, everything will be completely ruled out, okay? Now, methodological naturalism rose at the same time as Darwinism did. And what did Darwinism do? Darwinism was there to challenge religion. Now, like I mentioned before, Darwin was not of that ilk. He did not subscribe to that perspective of using his theory to challenge religion. Others did. Now, Darwin's bulldog is somebody by the name Thomas Henry Huxley, a hardcore atheist and an icon for the atheists who came after him. Now, his grandson, his name was Julian Huxley. Julian Huxley came in the beginning of the 20th century, and he was an evolutionary biologist, and he was a hardcore atheist. So he wrote a book called Religion Without Revelation. Now, what comes to mind when you think of religion without revelation? It's very hard to explain, because religion is supposed to be
some divine revelation.
So he believed the religion without revelation was evolutionary naturalism. So he wrote this book around the time of the Second World War. In fact, I had the copy from back in that time, and you can see that you can tell this was literally a book written in that very interesting historical period. And he believed that it was their job to get the belief in God out of people.
Like a religious duty.
Like a religious duty. And he was not just somebody working in some little shadow of the biological community. He was one of the key figures in what was known as the modern synthesis. The modern synthesis was taking classical Darwinism and mixing it with Mendelian genetics, right? And that was called the modern synthesis, which is still being referred to as neo-Darwinism. Now, what post was he at? Well, clearly, anybody like that, you would not want them to teach your children, right? Because this is somebody that is not just saying, oh, evolution is true. They're saying evolution is true, therefore there's no God, which is obviously a non sequitur, but they are essentially arguing for materialism and atheism. He was the first and the founder of UNESCO. Now, what's UNESCO? The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. What do? they're a governing body of the UN. What does that do? That's there to impact the systems globally.
And curriculums, yeah.
What does that say to you about the liberal project? Because remember, the UN is a liberal project. Liberalism was facilitated through Darwinism. We know that. This is why humanists in the UK and humanists in other places, they always refer to Darwin, and the humanist societies are at the forefront of fighting intelligent design and all these types of challenges to Darwinism. So what we find is there's some very interesting aspects of Darwinism which shows it's more than a theory. Now, Mary Midgley was a British philosopher, and again, she noted, wait a minute, this is acting like a religion. Darwinism is acting like a religious force. So she wrote a book called Evolution as Religion. And again, she's talking about the sociological aspects of Darwinism becoming into an actual religion. Now, why did it become into a religion? Well, clearly it became into a religion because it facilitated a belief system. And the belief system that it facilitated is that of atheism. So Dawkins himself writes this in The Blind Watchmaker. He said that before Darwin, it was possible to be atheist. It's possible to be an atheist, but Darwin allowed us to be an intellectually satisfied atheist, right? So before natural selection could explain biological design, the only explanation they had was God. Now, what I found interesting was Michael Roos, who's considered the top Darwinist in the world, right? Academically, if you look at anything that you want to look at in terms of its highest apex, say the Anthology of Philosophy of Biology by Oxford University, right? The editor of that is Michael Roos. The editor of, not just someone who publishes in journals, but the actual editor of a journal is Michael Roos. So Michael Roos, being a Darwinist and an atheist, he wrote a very popular book called Darwinism as Religion, right? In 2016. And this book was published by Oxford University. I used this book as evidence in my debate with Aaron Ra, right? Because what we want to show is you have a scientific theory which has turned into a religion, which should not have turned into a religion, but it has turned into a religion. One of the things that Roos argues in that book is that Darwinism functions as a religion, right? In the same way that it's like a secular religious perspective. Now, while this was happening to Darwinism, something else was happening in philosophy at the same time. And that was a movement known as the Vienna Circle, right? The Vienna Circle were a group of philosophers who were very influenced by naturalism. They were very influenced by this idea that we could explain everything naturalistically. So they together wanted to revise epistemology, revise the way that we come up with how we know anything. And their answer to that was logical positivism. What we're going to do is we're going to say, for anything to count as knowledge, it has to be scientific. And why that's so dangerous is because automatically you've ruled out the existence of God. Automatically, you've ruled out the soul. Automatically, you've ruled out anything which is immaterial. So this logical positivist movement, it started off philosophically. Then it was completely refuted. It's refuted from the perspective that there's many different forms of knowledge which philosophers acknowledge, like testimony, like mathematics, like logic, like values, morals, all of these things which are not scientific, but we believe them to be true, right? We all use maths, we all use logic, we believe in morals, we believe in these things. But also the fact that all knowledge, to be counted as knowledge, must be scientific. That proposition itself is not a scientific proposition. That's a philosophical proposition. So anyway, logical positivism died. But the jinn, the ghost of logical positivism, lived on in the movement that we now call scientism. So that's where scientism comes in. And scientism, broadly defined, is this idea that nothing is to be believed except what can be scientifically proven, right? That ghost of scientism was used by the new atheists to push atheism and to challenge, religion. So that you see the link between.
I see the link, but where does the image of neutrality come from? Because the default position that they enjoy in the average public's mind is that science and scientism and the new atheism movement, it's unbiased. That it's scientific. Therefore, scientific inquiry is based on the scientific method, the five senses, and so on. Where do they get that facade from, where they appear as unbiased, appear as a separate source, completely outside, which doesn't have a dog in the game or skin in the game? Where do they get that from?
That's an excellent question, and you're the first podcaster to ask me that question. The answer to that is they get it from the mantle of science being misused. So we have the likes of Richard Dawkins, who is somebody who has a PhD in zoology. So someone like him, when they say something, people will not take it as this is the opinion of Richard Dawkins.
No.
They will take it as this is the opinion of science.
This is scientific fact.
So the scientific statements being made are not being distinguished from the statements being made by scientists. So let me just explain that in a bit more detail. Philosophy is dead. Who said that? Stephen Hawking. Now, Stephen Hawking is a scientist.
Yes.
When a scientist says philosophy is dead, the average public is going to think the scientist Stephen Hawking is saying, we are saying that philosophy is dead. When actually, he is making that statement in his own personal capacity. And obviously the problem with that statement, right, is that itself is a philosophical statement. So, see, this is really, really interesting. When I mentioned Michael Roos earlier, when the God delusion first came out, right, the very first challenge to Dawkins, the most credible criticism, was actually by Michael Roos. And actually the banga, as we call it in Urdu, or the altercation started by Dawkins himself, because Dawkins, in the God delusion, he calls Michael Roos basically the intellectual Neville Chamberlain, right? So he was, okay, in Michael Roos's own, when I interviewed him about this, I've interviewed him a few times on different topics. When I interviewed him about this, he said, well, if you...
And he's framing himself as the... What's his face? The bulldog.
Churchill.
He said,
yeah, he doesn't say it, but that's what he means.
He's the Churchill. And he's willing to bomb Dresden. Yeah. He's willing to massacre civilians because he's willing to fight the Hitlerian manifestation of Islam.
So he's not gonna come back with Munich with a piece of paper in his hand saying peace in Europe. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, Michael Roos said to me, well, if you see what Dawkins says about me, then you know I have reasons to be pissed off, right? So what he was referring to is his approach being that of conforming to religious sentiment. When actually this is a very unfair characterization of Michael Roos, because Michael Roos is a critic of intelligent design. He is a critic. He's had debates with people who believe in God, because obviously he's an atheist. In fact, I hosted a debate between Michael Roos and William Dembski earlier on this year, and they're both very strong in their perspectives. You have someone who believes in God, someone who does not believe in God, and they're having a discussion. So Michael Roos famously said about Dawkins' book that his book makes me embarrassed to be an atheist. So when I asked Roos, okay, he's obviously an atheist and a Darwinist, and so is Dawkins. So I said to him, is the reason that you are different to Dawkins in terms of how you view religion, God, and all these types of things, I mean, your difference with him, is it that you're not affected by scientism in the way that he is, right? And his answer was in the affirmative. His answer was, yes, that's the problem. His answer was that, his entire perspective is very poor philosophically. In fact, he said something interesting. He said if Dawkins handed this in as a first-year undergrad to one of his professors, that his basic argument, it would have failed, right? So what we find is that these common threads were running through. The neo-Darwinist theory was running at the beginning of the 20th century through classical Darwinism, and scientism took off after logical positivism.
Right.
And then what we find is all these rivers converged at the beginning of the 21st century. And that's where the new atheist movement took off. Now, we've been talking about the
font of new atheism.
Yes.
No, but okay, just some quick questions that came up in my head. That do you think it's a disposition where Rus is non-confrontational and it's just like a personality type, or do you think it's much deeper than that? Because it's really funny because the Chamberlain and Churchill analysis is now being used to argue the Ukraine war, for example, that we need a Churchill who will be willing to knock at the gates of Russia and initiate a fight which needs to be fought, and we don't need this Chamberlain. So that sort of rhetoric is used to justify a kind of an attitude of aggression, of war, of not accepting a truce or a status quo. Do you think this is a personal disposition and a difference between the way Rus is as a man and Dawkins is as a man? Or do you think it's much deeper in terms of the philosophy of how they argue their positions?
Okay, you know what? That's a really interesting way of putting it, because I would say the answer is the Neville Chamberlain Churchill analogy is a disanalogy. The reason why is because Chamberlain wanted peace, and him as a person, he was placid compared to Churchill, who was more of a warish person. And they both saw Hitler as a potential threat. One wanted to go down the peace route, one wanted to go down the war route. The difference is Michael Rus, he is somebody who believes religion to be false. He believes that the belief in God is not something that is rational from his perspective. Now, you can, in the same way Dawkins admits you can come up with a rational argument for, say, deism, both of them are in the same camp. It's not like, one wants peace and one wants war. They both believe they're right. They both believe in atheism. They both believe in Darwinism. I would say the difference is Michael Rus is being intellectually honest and Richard Dawkins is being intellectually dishonest. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the arguments being made by Dawkins have been pointed out to be false by atheist philosophers. Now, if he wanted to make a full frontal attack against religion, then at least be honest. At least use arguments which are valid. At least don't manipulate the fact that a lot of people, like he mentioned, they think if you believe in evolution, you have to be an atheist. You're going to use the ignorance of people as an argument for your position.
Right.
So it was, this is why I think your question is excellent, because it's a disanalogy that both of them, if you like, are not, Chamberlain is like Rus and Dawkins is like Churchill. Rus and Dawkins both have the same worldview, but the academic honesty is divergent in terms of how they come to things.
So, and where do you think they differ? In that they both see religion as an opponent to rationality, at least in their worldview. The difference is that Dawkins has more of a proselytizing energy. Is that what you would describe it as?
I would say...
Because proselytizers tend to be disingenuous sometimes with their arguments, and I made the joke earlier that they're equally as disingenuous as us. The joke being that sometimes you do get religious proselytizers who will frame an argument in an unfair way.
I'll give you the answer which Rus gave to me about what he thinks Dawkins is doing. He said that Dawkins wrote an excellent book, The Selfish Gene. The Selfish Gene was a popularization of neo-Darwinism, and that was an immensely popular book, even by people who are opponents of Dawkins, like Dennis Noble. They would say he's an excellent writer. Now, according to Rus, the success of The Selfish Gene, it gave Dawkins a confidence in which he could make poor arguments and believe he's right. And because of the way that the vast majority of people, even though they think they're intellectual, they're not, they would just lap up anything written by somebody who's a professor at Oxford. He was so successful with his sales and his popularity that he just started to believe his own nonsense. That was literally the answer that Michael Rus was giving me. And he didn't just say it once as a slip of tongue. He mentioned it several times. So the success that he had from his previous book, The Selfish Gene, it became something that he could use to piggyback other nonsensical ideas.
So the problem with him and guys like Sam Harris, you're saying, is that they're enterprising and they end up becoming public intellectuals, which then means that the rigor of their arguments and the rigor of the research that they're doing and putting into their work becomes weaker. They're more pandering to an audience, and
absolutely,
they're more playing up for audience. Then what is the reason that Western audiences were primed for this line of argumentation and this kind of a worldview? Because these guys became cultural giants in the 21st century, in the last 20, 30 odd years. The audience in the West, as well as to a large extent in the East, was primed for this kind of argumentation. Do you think that there was sort of people were done with religion or religiosity? Were they tired of religion and religiosity? What was the mix-up? Why did it work as a formula? Because you're never marketing a product or service that doesn't sell.
That's an excellent point. And what I would say is it goes back to an experiment to do with jam jars a few years ago. I was reading that in a supermarket, they set up a table with around 24 jams, and you could go up and you could taste the jams and you could say, okay, I want this one, that one, or whatever. And then you would have another table in a different part of the supermarket with the same sort of people walking around, and you have 6 jams and you taste out the different jams, and then you realize, okay, I'm going to go for this, I'm going to go for that. Now, you as somebody who's clearly a businessman in some capacity, which one would you predict is going to make more sales? The one with 6 jams or 24?
The 6 jam ones.
You're right.
Obviously.
The reason is simplicity.
Yes.
We want the world to be simple. We want the world to be black and white. It's so easy to say religion versus reason. It's so easy to say the world is made up of indivisible atoms. But if I turn around to you and I say, I'm sorry, the world is not made of indivisible atoms. The world of quantum mechanics shows us that you can interpret the world through the Copenhagen school of thought, or through the relational, or the informational, or the many worlds, or the shut up and calculate. And it's way more complicated, and you can have a particular observation which is affected by the observer. You would say, no. Subboor, I rather have the world of indivisible atoms than have the crazy world of quantum mechanics. But the problem is the world is far more complex than we want. Any narrative that takes off, the simpler it is, the easier it is for people to accept. We just had a terrorist attack in which we had 2 buildings destroyed. Evil people, barbaric people, we need to get them.
Bad religion.
So much evil. And at the same time that there is a giant military operation pointing its finger to these savages, it is so convenient that we can ideologically say, dehumanize these people. And this is why what I would say is this. The most important debate that happened about new atheism is not the debate between, say, William Lane Craig and Sam Harris. It is not the debate between John Lennox and Richard Dawkins. It's actually the debate between Christopher Hitchens and George Galloway about the Iraq War. The cheerleader of the Iraq War in Britain was Christopher Hitchens. In fact,
new atheism has a politics as well, like an angle.
Of course. And Christopher Hitchens was a vocal supporter of the Iraq War, and he saw this as a part of his new atheist crusade. And then in that debate, what you clearly saw is, regardless of how illogical it was to attack Iraq, it still happened. Now, new atheists, they would love to wash their hands of that historical period and get people to maybe forget about what happened. But we have to remember, they were cheerleaders for the dehumanization of Muslims. They were cheerleaders for the Iraq War. And they were cheerleaders, in fact, for many of the anti-Islamic polemics that we see all over the internet today.
So, okay, here's what I understood from your presentation there. You said that the scientific essentialism, which allows people like Richard Dawkins to simplify their worldview, which is palatable for the average public. You might be an absolute ignoramus, but you see New York Times bestseller, I'm buying that, it makes sense. Case in point that self-help books are also bestsellers. So, I mean, it should be obvious at this point that a bestseller is not, any mark of merit. So, the funny or hypocritical or the self-contradictory thing is that their religious zeal in promoting a simplified worldview is what so them organizing as a religion is what made them successful. That's what you're arguing.
Interestingly, yes.
But then if the flip side of that would be that we also have a simplifying worldview in terms of, in this case, Islam and Atheism. And we too, with our religious zeal, would like to simplify the average audience's worldview and yani, what we would call the Ammi. Maybe the new atheist doesn't know of all these things, but they would argue that we do the same with religion, that we would simplify for an average man, a layperson, their worldview, and then give them political, social, economic solutions based on that. They're doing more of the same. You're simply saying they're hypocritical because they don't admit it.
No, the way I would address that point is, I would say that's a non sequitur. You're making things simple. We're making things simple. The argument is not that why are you making things simple while we're making things simple so we're both equal. The argument is you are coming up with a false narrative and you're simplifying a very complex situation. In our case, we're simplifying a situation which is actually simple. So for example, when it comes to religion, we are saying that there's one God. We're saying that, we believe in God, we believe in God's messengers, we believe in this, we believe in that. And, the Marxist sort of view religion is the opiate of the people, of the masses, because it's simple, it fulfills their needs. Well, we could say the same thing about new atheism as well. The difference here is we're saying it's false. Your view about religion being a negative force in terms of the scientific enterprise is false. Your view of religion having a monopoly on state violence is false. Your view that religion being a curtailment of basic human rights, freedom of speech, again, is false. So it's a position of where we're pointing out, it's not that, we're both the same. It's that your narrative is actually false. And what we could do is this.
So the problem is not with the simplification of the world.
Yes.
That's simply to do with the popularity of the world.
That's simply to do with marketing.
Marketing, right?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. But the problem lies therein is that your base assumptions are incorrect.
Yes.
Okay, then the further question would be, for the religious angle, is that how do we end up with such nuance on behalf of academics like you, where you see the problems like the Iraq war and new atheism with such nuance, you're able to distinguish between, different lines of argument, different fields of inquiry. You talked about the scientific method. We can even look at physics from different angles, like you mentioned. We can look at it from the Copenhagen school, the simple Newtonian style model that we used to have in high school and O levels and A levels. How do you get from that simplified worldview of religion, of Islam in this case, how do we get Subboor Ahmad to be able to understand such deep nuance and to be able to argue in such a nuanced fashion? And why is it that you end up with a new atheist who is ignorant to that nuance?
Well, I would say anybody who is intellectually honest, anybody who is intellectually well-read, they would come to conclusions which would require a lot of nuance, which would require a lot of foresight in the way that they explain something because they know how different threads are linked, which is why I can have a very respectable conversation with someone that I totally disagree with theologically, like Michael Roos. Now, why is it that we both can have a disagreement or even better, say between William Dembski and Michael Roos, where they can disagree theologically, but they can still speak in a civilized manner and they can actually acknowledge points within each other's arguments? It's just to do with intellectual honesty. The problem with the new atheist narrative was it began off with a falsehood. It began off with a lie. It began off, in fact, with a demonization of a particular group of people. And when you start off in a flat-footed way with that assumption, then everything else that you do down the line is going to be wrong. And this is why I want to bring in another point in this, which is very much important. When we have the likes of, say, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his greatest achievement is being done right now on this earth. We are finding people becoming Muslims in Latin America, in the most remote parts of the world. Islam is growing in the last 1400 years. Any social movement, it normally does its best during the lifetime of its founder, sometimes better afterwards, but then goes down. Why is it that the new atheist movement has pretty much died within the lifetime of the new atheists while they're alive? And the reason for that we should get into, because it's linked to everything I've been saying. It's linked to the fact that the massive mechanism that was being launched in terms of the full frontal attack of Islam, the war on terror narrative, Why is it? Is it just a coincidence that the war on terror narrative has declined and new atheism has declined at the same time?
The money dried up.
Not only the money, I would say the motivation to give these people a platform, the motivation in terms of look.
So are you suggesting? I know you're an academic and you wouldn't do that, so I'll do it on your behalf. Are you suggesting that there was some sort of media and academic astroturfing of these kinds of characters, that they were propped up with money and with lobbying because they were the need of the hour, they were the tip of the spear when it came to fighting Islam?
I would put it another way. I would say that they took the opportunity when they had it.
They weren't necessarily placed there, but they were opportune. So that's what I said initially, that the difference between a Roos and a Dawkins is that one is enterprising and opportunistic, and the other is more academically inclined.
Yeah. So we can think of it from another perspective of, say, somebody who only came to the argument politically. C.J. Wellerman, very well-known internet personality, podcaster. He was somebody that began off with new atheists, right? A lot of people don't know that. And he was an opponent of Islam. Once he realized, wait a minute, this new atheist project is simply a Western imperial project, he switched. So even though now he's still an atheist, you find politically he's totally aligned with the Muslim world, right? And you find the C.J. Wellerman program. What you find is that he's defending the Palestinians and he's defending Muslims. Why is he doing that? And if you look at his journey is very interesting, and he documents it in his book, in which he basically realized the new atheist project is a Western imperial project. It's not just about reason versus religion. It's far more than that. And he's just one person.
There's an element of justifying conquest in it. It's not just like a social project.
No, absolutely. It's not just about Islam is false. Now, something else which is interesting, and I pointed this out to Alex O'Connor when we had our discussion 4 years ago, and I'm glad that he recently made a video, which you can find on YouTube, just released a few days ago, in which he acknowledged this, that he moved away from new atheism.
No, Alex, by the way, I just want to point this out. I suspect he won't be watching this, but Alex seems more balanced, considering that he's much younger than most of the new atheists. He doesn't seem to be on that Western imperialist agenda. He might be anti-Islam, but he doesn't seem
I wouldn't even say he's anti-Islam anymore.
Really?
I would not say that. In fact, I think he's come around to having a much more nuanced view of religions in general. And that's probably to do with him studying theology at Oxford. Because when you study things at a deeper level, you realize, wait a minute. I mean, it's just, an interesting side point. If you want to hold on to that, the West is the best, and why did the scientific method only come around in the Western world 500 years ago? The Sam Harris view, the Jordan Peterson view, right? But then when you realize, wait a minute, the Enlightenment was directly influenced by the Islamic Renaissance. Wait a minute, European manuscripts were direct translations of Arabic to
and
Latin.
Persian,
So when we find that, and as here on a reference, Patricia Farah's book, Science: A 4,000-Year History, when you find that actually science goes back way further than 500 years ago, and in fact, for the vast majority of this time, not only was science pioneered by theists, and this is where things get really interesting, now academics are talking about the fact that you need a theistic worldview, a theistic perspective, to begin an inquiry about the world in the way that scientists actually do. Now, obviously, some of the academics disagree with them and they have their discussions, but for example, things like uniformity of nature, or the fact that the mind that the world is universally understandable and that it's rationally accessible. There's going to be patterns.
It is in of itself a religious presupposition.
Absolutely. Yeah. And not only that, one of the things that Patricia Farah says in her book about the Muslim civilization, remember, she doesn't have a religious, she's not being paid by Muslims to just say positive things about Islam. She's an academic covering the trajectory of the scientific method. She says the Muslims saw science as a religious, sacred, spiritual duty. I'm paraphrasing basically what she's saying. The reason why Muslims were at the forefront is not because, as Sam Harris was saying, oh, they were just, fixing calendars for prayer times. No, they were, this such a...
That kind of argument could be flipped and said that the British empiricism was only interested in projectile motion for cannons. I mean, it's what a ridiculous, caricature of a civilization.
Yeah, and the funny thing is when we find Ibn Haytham, right? Now, Ibn Haytham, what's interesting about him is he's been mischaracterized purely as a scientist.
Sorry, I want to cut you off there. The same Sam Harris would argue that within the Jewish tradition, the reason for their, very enterprising nature is it's because of the Jewish tradition. And here the argument is in spite of the tradition. You get what I'm saying? Like, that would be seen as a positive because, the Jewish tradition had a big focus on lettering and writing. That's why you see so many. I've heard him make this argument.
You do.
It's an implicit racism which they're not willing to admit.
No, absolutely.
They just don't like brown people.
And it's so cheesy in terms of the cut and paste way that they operate, because say you even take something like warfare, because he's big on that, Muslims are militant, and he says,
I think he's watched 4 Lions too many times.
Yeah, well, he says in his book he quotes the narration of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that paradise is under the shade of swords. Okay, so he just says that paradise is under the shade of swords. Now when you hear that paradise is under the shade of the swords, then you would think to yourself, okay, constant warfare, constant fighting, constant military, constant conquest. But look up the narration itself. The narration just doesn't say paradise is under the shade of the swords. To paraphrase what the narration says, it is, do not expect to encounter the enemy. But if you do encounter them, then be patient and know that paradise is under the shade of swords. A totally different,
it's a total mischaracterization.
Total mischaracterization. Now, if I've just paraphrased it there, anybody can look up that narration and they'll see it's along those lines that I said. The fact is, you can't do that. I mean, you can't get away with something like that, because it's going to take 2 seconds for somebody to Google search that and show that you're an ignoramus. In the same way, when we have people like Harris saying, "Oh, it's just about the particular prayer times that they were fixing calendars." Well, then when we have people like Ibn Haytham, who says that his reason to do science is to get closer to his Lord, literally what he's saying. How can you get that statement to match your silly statement about Muslims are doing this because they're trying to get, closer to just prayer times or whatever? And I wanted to just add something in here, which is the new book, The Death of Neo-Darwinism, which inshallah is going to be published by Sapiens very soon, before the end of the year. I've only put one Islamic quotation there, only one. And what I did right at the beginning of the book, and I'm going to paraphrase this narration, is that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, reflect deeply upon creation, do not reflect upon Allah, because you can't basically comprehend Allah except by believing in him. Comprehend his essence. So me paraphrasing that narration, the reason why I'm saying that now is because that is the Islamic worldview.
Civilizational motivation is that basically.
Yeah. We do not say what a solipsist would essentially say. Everything must be justified. There's no such thing as axioms. There's no such thing as, foundational beliefs, because, we all know that's nonsense, right? But what we do say is, yes, there are certain things theologically we can never understand about Allah. However, when it comes to the world, Islam teaches to reflect deeply. Islam teaches to do science. One of the things which I found really beautiful is I went to visit Dr. Farid Khan, who's a academic who has a PhD from Cambridge. He set up Protein Technologies, a company based in Manchester. And he's somebody in his, he's published in very prestigious scientific journals. And I went to go visit him in his scientific lab. And he's all about the Islamic Renaissance and doing these, encouraging young Muslim academics to be involved in science. And, he said something beautiful. He says, this is where we do our sajda. Talking about his scientific lab, he said, this is where we do our sajda. So this is the Islamic worldview. This is why Islam, in the natural selection of ideas, is going to survive. And this is why Dawkins will be deselected.
He's been deselected and relegated to cultural Christianity. That's the new Dawkins. He said, "I'm a cultural Christian." Even like what was that woman, the African lady,
Ayana,
she's also become a Christian, and in that same vein, in the similar sort of vein, you see Jordan Peterson also touting new atheist politics.
Yes,
but with an element of spirituality.
So this is interesting.
Can I take a little quick break? I have to pee.
Yeah.
So in a similar vein, you have people like Jordan Peterson who, like we were discussing earlier before the podcast, that their opposition to new atheism might be grounded in some vague sort of spirituality or religiosity or the Judeo-Christian tradition, but their politics is not too dissimilar when it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to the Muslim world. It's more of the same.
So that's interesting, because while we were having lunch, you said something that I disagreed with you on initially, and then I saw actually that you have a point there. So you said, well, Jordan Peterson is part of the new atheism package. And I said, not really, because, his sort of belief in God in some way. And he said,
"What do you mean, God?"
Yeah, that famous. I was there actually, funny enough.
You were in the audience?
Yeah, well, we were organizing. It was one of those things that when you said it, I said, okay, that didn't make sense to me. But then when you explained, well, if you look at new atheism giving the if you like, the intellectual grounding for Western imperialism, the white man's burden, all Peterson's basically doing is, well, my fellow new atheists, you're trying to prop up the Western civilization using new atheism, and that's not going to work. Let's try and prop up the Western civilization using this Judeo-Christian worldview. So in that light, yeah, he does fit into that new atheist program. And what's interesting is that everything that Nietzsche predicted, let's make the dichotomy between old atheism and new atheism. Old atheists like Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and others, they were willing to accept the implications of their worldview. Schopenhauer would not be somebody that's going to run away from the absurd sort of conclusions that you would come to in terms of what does his worldview lead to. Yeah, my fellow human being is my fellow sufferer, right? So the dark nihilistic understanding of the world as understood by the old secularist atheists, whatever you want to call them, whichever camp you want to label them as, the fact is the new atheists wanted to build a bright world, right? They wanted to build a bright world. We can believe in human rights, we can believe in this, we can believe in that, but there is no grounding. Now, something interesting I found Douglas Murray saying in his book, The Strange Death of Europe, is he points out, and he's in the same dilemma, which is we need some sort of religious justification for human rights, because you can't just have human rights grounded in nothing.
Metaphysical, divine grounding. Yeah.
So, so the problem now is, how can we defend a worldview when we cannot ground it in anything? And so this is the hypocrisy that's in front of us now, where we find new atheists saying, we believe in this, we believe in that, but actually there's no justification. And one interesting interaction happened between John Lennox and Richard Dawkins in their very public debate. And I took this interaction and I analyzed it in my book. So the interaction went along in the following way. Now, we know that if you are a pure Darwinian, right, then it's going to be you versus the postman. It's going to be you versus your neighbor. It's going to be, as David Stove in his book colorfully puts it, even though he's an atheist and he does believe in Darwinism, the social Darwinists or the evolutionary psychologists, as they came later to be known, their worldview leads to absurdities, right? So how do you ground morals and things being right or wrong when at the same time you're saying there's no such thing as right and wrong? So Lennox brought up this point and he said to Dawkins, well, you've been making moral arguments, right? Your entire perspective is moral. This is right, this is wrong. But how can you say that when you say in your earlier book, River Out of Eden, there is no right, there is no wrong, there's nothing, there's no design, there's nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. We simply dance to our DNA. So how do you marry these? Now, Dawkins' view is, well, we should learn to rise above our genetic dispositions. We should rebel. And so Lennox puts a very good point to him. What is it that rebels? So, look.
In us, what is it that compels us to be better than our genetic disposition?
Exactly. So if genes created us mind and body, right? So let's take that central dogma of molecular biology. If it's from your genetics to your disposition, to your body, to your mind, everything is very clear in terms of the way that you are. Then what is it that rebels? Now, I'll be referring to some sort of soul, some sort of Cartesian dualism. It's incoherent. And Dawkins didn't actually have an answer. All he simply did is repeat his mantra of, well, we rebel against our genetics every single time we use a condom. We rebel against our genetics every single time we do something that goes against these types of things. But the problem there is he's pointing out something which goes against the Darwinian prediction of human behavior, as opposed to giving us an explanation of what rebels within the body. So atheists cannot explain the origin, new atheists cannot explain the origin of our good self purely by referring to evolutionary biology. We know we can't do that. Yet all of their moral arguments are based on, there has to be some sort of grounding, there has to be some sort of objectivity. Without it, it's incoherent. So what do people like Peterson do? You have theists who say, we believe in moral realism. You have relativists who obviously don't believe in that. Then you have new atheists who pretend they believe in moral realism, although they sort of on the side, under the cuff, say there's no such thing. Then you have the likes of Peterson, who simply swims around in vagueness in the hope that somehow we can revive some form of morality, grounded in some belief in God, without going full-fledged religion. And that's the basic problem that we saw in the recent discussion between Peterson and
Dawkins, hosted by our friend Alex O'Connor. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, what do we find there? What we find is somehow Richard Dawkins is making more sense than Peterson.
Yeah.
Like that, I did a reaction to this and I just found it funny because I could just see that, Dawkins is clearly, dealing with a dilemma, the dilemma that Lennox pointed out, right? And we can see this. But Peterson's not really doing a better job. And this is the problem. If you want to revive the idea of the Western civilization without actually saying, okay, we have to go back to some form of Protestant Christianity or whatever it is.
Or Catholic, whatever. Yeah.
Whatever. The fact is, you have a massive hole in your theory. And it's just not being pointed out. And someone needs to be brave enough to say, well, perhaps a religion which has not given up can fulfill that role.
What I've observed, and you can let me know if I'm correct in my observation, is that there is a parallel religious tradition of the New Age religion of good living, physical fitness, having spiritual experiences outside of religious frameworks. Using hallucinogenics or drugs of any sort, or biochemical processes like breathing techniques and what have you. That Mr. Peterson and his followers and his ilk in general, that whole intellectual dark web, they always seem to go hand in hand with that kind of religiosity or that kind of spirituality, to create experiences bigger than the self, bigger than the individual, to have some connection with the metaphysical, and yet ground themselves in this biological sort of essentialism or this scientism. It's an attempt to marry new atheism and that religious grounding that they feel that they need for social function. Because I think there's an opportunism which comes with people like Dr. Jordan Peterson, which is that they see the dysfunctionality of the West, just on a social molecular level, just woman to man, man to man, woman to woman, parents and children, children and parents in high schools, all of these things. And do you think that they're trying to shoehorn in religion where they don't get the negative aspects of religion? They only get the good stuff out of religion. Because I've heard serious public figures say we need to get the good stuff out of religion. Even Jordan Peterson, for example, is a big collector of Native American memorabilia. Like he tries to create this sort of North American style spirituality, connection with the land and with the spirits of the air or whatever. He comments less about this in his public appearances, but I have studied him thoroughly online, and he does have this strange tangent to his personal life where he collects Native American memorabilia and almost considers them as religious or spiritual artifacts. What do you think the end? Because even, and you saw that even with Dawkins saying something to the effect of, if I'm not wrong, I'm a cultural Christian. I like the bells of churches and not the azan or its noise to me, and this is beautiful like music or something. Where does the synthesis happen? Where will the civilization? Where will the buck stop for this civilization? This Western Judeo-Christian hodgepodge.
You know, it's really interesting you said that, because I was thinking back to a discussion that happened between Alistair McGrath and Brett Weinstein when it came to literal truths and metaphorical truths, right? So religion or God can be argued to be metaphorically true, right? Now, let's just say that metaphorical truth is quite broad, right? That God or Christianity, let's just treat it as one particular thing that we're not going to take too seriously. We're not going to say the virgin birth actually took place. There's a really funny clip in which, Dawkins is asking Peterson about him believing in the virgin birth, and then O'Connor turns around and says, you must understand what he's asking you. Like, he's asking you, do you believe in the virgin birth? And he just wouldn't give a straight answer to that.
No, he started talking about how a society that sanctifies the woman and the child, some vagaries about...
Vagaries. So let's just call it the vague camp, right?
Vague camp.
The problem with the vague camp is they want you to say, look, forget Islam, it's about ayahuasca, right?
Yeah.
It's all about, let's just go back and we can find some sort of form of meaning. We can have these metaphors, we can have these archetypes. These archetypes are linked to the idea of the meme and, just all this stuff. But the fact of the matter is, everything ultimately will have to be justified. And the problem is, if you want to have a worldview which is going to compete in the world of ideas, then natural selection is going to select ideas that are grounded. And the problem with the vague camp is they can't ground their ideas. It's in a way they're applying a consequentialist perspective to look at what is their truth. Now, what's interesting, I found in that discussion between Justin O'Brien and Alex O'Connor is that Alex mentioned that during the debate that I had with him, I raised a point to him, which was misunderstood as some atheists, by some atheists to be an argument for God. But obviously Alex understood I wasn't making an argument for God. The position I put forward to him, and later on in that discussion with O'Brien, he acknowledged that I got him to think, right, was if your aim is maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, and here are some studies to show that belief in God would give you a happier life, why are you here arguing? And he said it made him think. And if you think about it, that's what this whole Peterson vague camp is about. It's not about truth.
So feeling good.
Yeah. It's not about, say, let's just break it down very clearly. It's not about the correspondence theory of truth. It's not about propositions that match the reality. It's about something which works. That's all it is. That's all it ultimately is. Now, I had a discussion with Alex Rosenberg, who is a well-known philosopher of biology, and his book is called An Atheist's Guide to Reality. He's referred to as a mad dog naturalist, right? Because the book is written to the atheist community to get them to acknowledge things which they don't want to maybe acknowledge. The physical facts fix the facts. Moral nihilism is the logical consequence of being grounded in a scientism perspective. So he's not saying you can't be a good person. He's not saying you can't have morals, but he's saying you can have nice nihilism, but you can't say that morals are true. So he's a realist. So I had a discussion with him in which it did come up this new perspective of you can call them the sort of positive psychology, vague camp people. So someone like him who's grounded in what is true and he wants to just stick to truth, he can't accept that nonsense, right? Likewise, I think a great deal of people, after they go through all of the Peterson stuff and the vague camp stuff, they will eventually ask the question, how do we know any of this is true? And that's where we will see the emperor has no clothes, which is why I believe Peterson has fallen out of favor in these last couple of years, because people have started to realize, wait a minute, he's trying to explain, how we should live our lives by referring to lobsters. He's trying to, break everything down in these very simplistic narratives without giving a proper justified position. So if you cannot do that, like I mentioned previously, in the natural selection of ideas, you will be selected out.
And you think that this slow sort of the movement of time is pushing out the new atheists, the new age religion types, the vague camp, and it's making space day by day, increasingly so, by the way. One would have assumed, okay, it's making space for Islam. That's my argument, because there was an initial argument that we saw that, as a reaction to 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that natural curiosity in Europe and America pushed people to Islam. But we see that it's sustained. It's not stopping. It's in fact, it's ramping up. It's becoming faster in women, especially, by the way. So what do you think that is? Is it just that desire for grounding, for some moral position in a metaphysical grounded, like a religious framework? Or is it something about Islam that is attracting people to this?
I love being on this podcast. We've been asking novel questions that got me to think. And I'll take it back to Rousseau, Hobbes, and the Islamic concept of the fitrah. I think that's what it's linked to, because if you look at the Western civilization, it's like good cop, bad cop, right? So, our noble savage nature of everyone living in an egalitarian way, that's Rousseau. Hobbes is, if you like, nature's red in tooth and claw. And if you look at the Western world, there is an element of internal aspects of Rousseau's way of living, right? But when it comes to the external, the outer group, the way that the Europeans treated others, that's where the Hobbes comes out, right?
Right.
And the fact is, human nature is neither Hobbes, because what we get with Hobbes is that, the pure social Darwinist sort of perspective. What we get with Rousseau is the egalitarian perspective. What we get with Islam, with the fitrah, is the realistic perspective. Human beings are not all morally good and egalitarian until the environment changes them, nor are they all evil and selfish, right? Until they find an opportunity to pretend to be not altruistic, right? As David Stove calls it, Darwinism is a slander against basically human nature by treating altruism as a problem as opposed to a reality. Islam, within this mix, just stands out. Look, I'll put it to you in a very blunt way. Sometimes when you are in a worldview, you don't realize the inconsistencies until you go online and you see all these challenges. And what starts to happen is you start to see, wait a minute, these people are saying this, these people are saying this thing is based upon this. And then if you're honest enough and you think critically, you will break things down to Islam. I had a very interesting couple of days in Bosnia recently, and I got to speak to Sniko. Sniko is somebody that I was...
A class act, by the way.
Yeah, yes.
I was like very judgmental, and I saw him in the vein of the Andrew Tates, and the guy is solid.
He's
through
solid.
And through. He's
solid. And what I would say is that, he had clearly some positions in the past which he moved away from. But what we found with him is this. What we found is that he went through the whole liberal paradigm. He went through, all these different isms, and eventually he just followed his fitrah. He just followed what he believed to be the right thing. And I asked him this question when I was, when we were doing this video, and you can find this on my channel. I was asking him about, the hedonistic, if you imagine someone like him, he has access to women that the vast majority of people cannot imagine. Access to wealth, access to all these things. Yet he's turning away from all these things and he's turning to Islam. And people like him are doing that. Why are they doing that? And the answer that you get from him, the answer that you get from others who follow that journey, is that it never leads to happiness, which is linked to human nature, because human nature, you will never truly be happy until you have a connection with your creator. And that's always been the Islamic line. So within all of these discussions and everything, what we have to keep in mind is human nature is fixed. That's not to say we're taking nature over nurture. I'm talking about the fact that you always have human beings with a, in Urdu we call it a zamir, or in English consciousness. You have something that draws you back, something that brings you back, something that calls you back. And if you are an honest, rational, intellectual person, you will come back to Islam, which is why Islam is actually growing in the West. If you imagine, from a purely sociological perspective, there should be more coconuts, right? Mm-hmm. There should be more sellouts and Uncle Toms in the Western world, Muslims, than they are in the Eastern world. Yet you find Muslims in the West are more conservative, more proud, more strong in their identities than sometimes the Muslims in the East. And that's a prediction which shouldn't come to fruition if their perspective is true.
They would argue that that is more of a tribalism as a reaction to being in the belly of the beast. And with us over here, because we know what Islam's actually like, we tend to gravitate towards the West, the superior, enlightened, civilized West.
That would go against social conformity. It's the human behavior, like we mentioned previously, human behavior is largely dictated by social factors, right? So what we find is, and these are really interesting experiments where, you know, you have people who are shown lines, right? And everybody, there's like 4 whatever people in the room, all of them are actors except one of them, and they're being asked which line is the shortest. All of them give the wrong answers, the actors, and then the actual test subject also gives the wrong answer. So he conforms to society as opposed to his own perception. So the fact is, why is it that it is against your self-interest to be a proud practicing Muslim in the Western world, in the belly of the beast, as they say, although I don't accept that sort of language? Why is it that those people are the strongest? And you can't just explain it away by saying, oh, they have a false impression of what Islam is, and the true impression of Islam exists in the East, which is why they're not as strong. That's a very weak answer.
But what about then, well, how would you explain that? Why do the people in the East, in the Muslim world, break out of social conformity and potentially harm themselves by not conforming to social norms and standards, and then distinguishing themselves as atheists or agnostics or liberals or Marxists or whatever?
Yeah, there's a very simple, easy answer to that. And the simple, easy answer to that is the success of any civilization will attract people from the opposing civilization. That's just a fact. Again, going back to human nature. So why is it that Adelaide of Bath, the first English scientist, he goes and he studies in Islamic Spain? Why is it that you had Europeans traveling to Islamic Spain dressed up as Arabs? Dressed up as Arabs, wearing the turbans. Why is it, and this is very interesting, something that was pointed out to me by Adnan Rashid.
Nice.
Why is it that British officials traveled to Mughal India at the height of its power, pre-takeover? This is before, you know, the East India Company became big. Why did they come here, and why did they wear shalwar kameez, and why did they wear turbans? Why is it that when they managed to become stronger, they came here in their khakis? Why were they dressed differently previously to this? Because they saw the Mughals as far superior to the inferior civilization that they came from their perspective. Later on, when the boot was on the other foot, that's when the Muslims started to copy them. Why is it? And I found this really interesting. I was watching this in a documentary that Jews living under the Greeks, they were super impressed by them. And some of the Jews, they actually tried to uncircumcise themselves by stretching their foreskins, right? Because the Greeks had a great civilization and they had, all this stuff going on. So it's natural for those people that you just pointed out to be aligning to the dominating worldview. So when you have liberals, say here in Pakistan or in Saudi Arabia or in Turkey, what are they doing? They are saying, oh, Dawkins says this, Bertrand Russell says this, referring to Yuval Noah Harari or whatever it is, or any of these types of liberals. Would they be doing that if the West was poor?
No.
No, they wouldn't be doing that.
Or not so militarily strong. Yeah.
Yeah. Another way of actually putting it is this. If we imagine, and I put this out and I think it really annoys atheists, right? If you imagine that Richard Dawkins' name was not Richard Dawkins. Let's imagine that Richard Dawkins' name in this thought experiment is Rahul Dravid from Calcutta University. The God Delusion is identical. It's the same book. It's the exact same book. Published in 2006.
Nobody cares.
Nobody gives a damn.
Yeah.
The only reason he's taken seriously is because he is a white man from the West, from a mainstream Western university. It's nothing to do with the actual argument. So when we understand from those...
Not to completely remove from its merits, but a large portion
No, I would. I actually would.
Okay.
I actually would. And the reason I would actually do that is because you will find it very hard to find an atheist defending Dawkins unless he misunderstands or misreads what he's actually saying. A lot of them don't even understand. Like, say, here in Pakistan, when you get these types of liberals, you get these types of people, right? They'll say, oh, you know, Dawkins says this or Dawkins says that. If you turn around and say to them, well, sure, but how does the strong anthropic principle fit within the central argument on page 156, 157? They have no idea what they're talking about. They literally do not have a single clue what they're talking about. In fact, sometimes, and this is where the kettle logic fallacy, I'll bring this in, right? So the kettle logic fallacy is a fallacy in which, to put it simply, I borrow a kettle from you, right? And this is in the days of the Victorians. It's a big black kettle, right? I borrow it from you and then I give it back to you and it's got 3 holes in it, right? And then you say to me, Subboor, you took my kettle. Why did you put holes in it? And I say to you the following. I did not put holes in it. When you gave it to me, it already had holes. I do not see any holes. The problem with all of these propositions is that they contradict each other.
Yes.
Now, it doesn't make sense for me to say that it never had holes.
And then I don't see any holes.
No, yeah. So it never had holes when you gave it to me, and that you put in the holes before you gave it to me. It's a contradiction. Often when it comes to their justification of morals, they will refer to kin selection, reciprocal altruism, they'll refer to the expanding circle, Peter Singel's view, all of these types of things, without understanding that actually many of those things, they do not fit, say, gender roles, toxic masculinity, patriarchy, all of these things that, remember, feminists attack us for. Yet evolutionary psychology, if you do want to base your worldview on, you know, evolution, and you do want to ground it purely in science, well, what we find is that evolutionary psychologists are saying natural selection selected patriarchy, selected toxic masculinity, selected gender roles as a fitness enhancing mechanism. So it's the exact opposite of what you claim it to be. And this is maybe a good segue into why the new atheists fell out of favor with the feminists. And
they did, and we're seeing it live, the meltdown. They are not, the new atheist movement is not with the project, it's not with Me Too, it's not with fourth wave, fifth wave, whichever wave of feminism we have right now. It's not with women reclaiming public spaces and all these things. But if somebody was to remain grounded in scientism and to see, from an evolutionary biology perspective, wouldn't they eventually sit and argue that as a consequence of time and material progress, this is the next step in our evolution? That is what someone like a Harari would argue, by the way. Although he doesn't argue it in this context, he argues it in more of a transhumanist context. But if they were to posit this, that this new order where we rip down patriarchy and patriarchal structures and we create more egalitarian structures are a consequence of our evolutionary biology, would this be a sound argument to make?
This would be the naturalistic fallacy. You cannot go from the way the world is to the way that the world should be. You cannot go from we are studying ants and we're looking at their inclusive fitness behavior to, when they're going into battle and they're not fertile. And then we're looking at that. And then I say to you, by the way, I think we should draw up this contract because it's more fair in terms of our business deal. You cannot go from the way the world is to the way the world should be. Number two, so it's not just the naturalistic fallacy here. How do you know that that is the right answer? Because what we have right now is a huge, huge battle between reductionism and holism, between the selfish gene perspective and group selectionist perspective or the holistic perspective. And if there is a complete rival system which exists right now in terms of evolutionary biology, you have neo-Darwinism and you have the third way of evolution. They don't agree at the fundamental level about what is it that is the causative power here. So Dawkins would say the causative power is the genome, and someone like Dennis Noble will say there's no privileged level of causation, but at a level of abstraction, we could say the organism is the one that's doing the purpose-driven behavior. That means your story that you put together about our behavior is explained by the selfish gene theory. That's broken as well. So there's two levels of problem here. One is you can't go from an is to the way the world should be, right? Secondly, the way the world is has two different camps which are fighting at the moment. So there's no other way of putting it. It's not just that your foundational worldview has crumbled. It's that your foundational worldview never had a foundation to crumble in the first place.
Okay, so what I understand from your argument is that there are two layers of flaws. The flaws being that you can't ground what is now into what ought to be, right? You can't argue about the nature of ants or the nature of lobsters, to be specific, and then try to argue that this is what ought to be in social contracts or financial contracts or any sort of organization.
Facts to values.
Facts to values. Okay.
Naturalistic fallacy.
I follow you there. In the second tier of the problem, you say that because there's two camps and whether or not the genome is driving the behavior or the organism as an individual itself is driving the behavior. Why is that such a big problem?
That's a huge problem because that would mean that evolutionary psychologists were climbing the wrong mountain for the past couple of decades. Now, evolutionary psychology is a new field, but previously to that, it was called sociobiology, and previously to that we had the social Darwinists, right? Now the social Darwinists, they did follow through with that fallacy. This is the way the world is, the way that we evolved. This is the way the world should be. And it was used to support racism. And this is even something which Yuval Noah Harari accepts in his book Sapiens. There's a book by Richard Weikart called From Darwin to Hitler. We see the link between Darwin, Ernst Haeckel, the German biologist, and the neo-Nazis. This is something, funnily enough, which Aaron Ra tried to claim that, Nazism has nothing to do with, Darwinism, and they were burning the books on biology. And I made a video on my channel in which I met a collector of he was collecting Nazi textbooks, and, there in German, clear, you had Darwinism. So look, the fact,
because the form of eugenics that the Nazis were practicing was grounded in some sort of
So, they try to say, Darwin has no role to play when it comes to social Darwinism or eugenics. Okay, so it just happens to be a coincidence that Darwin's son Leonard Darwin was the president of the Eugenics Society. It just happens to be a coincidence that, Herbert Spencer is a Darwinist and his relative, and, these are all just coincidences. Okay, fine, those are coincidences. Let's accept that sloppy logic. The fact is, you cannot ground your worldview in something from a fact to a value and where those facts are not agreed upon, because the discussion between holism and reductionism, the holism between the gene-centric view and the organism view, they give totally different ideas of what human behavior should be like, which is why the idea of selfishness, right, what Dennis Noble says about Richard Dawkins is, he doesn't understand that his position sounds like a very religious position, because if we're born selfish, then this is no different to the original sin.
Yes.
He doesn't recognize that this is
the Christian original sin concept
it parallels to that, like we're made with this crooked nature. So I would say this whole discussion about new atheism and liberalism and everything that we're doing right now, vast majority of people cannot be bothered to look at the foundations. And that's been the fundamental problem I've seen with a lot of them.
So let me just recap for the audience. We've been through Darwinism, logical positivism, and then all of these converging at new atheism in the 21st century. This is about 200-300 years of European, Western, Judeo-Christian history. And now you see not only that new atheism is dying out, but even the groups that formed together to make it whole are splitting up, like with the feminist movement and what was that unholy trinity?
The unholy trinity. Okay.
Yeah, you had a talk somewhere.
Yeah, so the unholy trinity is a talk I gave on atheism, Darwinism, and feminism. So what I basically did here is I took one episode, an interesting episode which happened in 2011. Incidentally, we happened to be outside, right? So this was the World Atheist Convention, and in this convention you had Aaron Ra, Richard Dawkins, Rebecca Watson, Thunderfoot. You had all these atheists. So we were outside of this convention, and inside this convention, Rebecca Watson, who was a representative of the feminists, she was going up in an elevator late in the night after one of the conferences. Somebody made a remark that she found to be unacceptable. You know, at that time, you know, we had this whole Me Too movement type of stuff going on. So that narrative of, you know, calling out bad behavior, it was there in the air, I think just before the Me Too stuff. So she came out and she said these things about how she felt. Dawkins attacked her, and there was already friction. Remember what I said earlier, evolutionary psychology, it explains patriarchy, explains toxic masculinity, and it explains gender roles as biological heritage that we have evolved under. So we've evolved with, rather. So that doesn't fit with in nature, you know, men and women lived in this egalitarian way, you know, this Rousseau idea of the noble savage, everyone being equal. That doesn't fit. What it's basically saying is it's saying that all of these things have a fitness enhancing function. Now, the problem with that is, number one, it doesn't fit their narrative. Number two, they want to explain patriarchy, and they want to explain toxic masculinity, and they want to explain gender roles as the construct of a male-dominated religion. But now it's not a male-dominated religion which is telling you patriarchy, toxic masculinity, gender roles. It's evolutionary psychology. So what do you have? You have evolutionary psychologists who are being attacked by feminists, and feminists are trying to claim that evolutionary psychologists misrepresent science. So Elaine Morgan, she wrote a book called The Descent of Woman, which is a parallel to Darwin's book, The Descent of Man. And she's trying to give an opposite view. Because remember Darwin considered the woman's brain to be inferior. Darwin made a little thought experiment for people to think about. He said, if you put together a list of all of the fields, right? So say today we can expand the field because back then the fields were less. Say you take art, music, physics, chemistry, biology, sociology, bioinformatics, paleontology. You take all of these fields and you list all of the pioneers, the founders, and the people who excel. The list is going to be filled with the names of men, not the names of women.
Darwin was black-pilled, yes?
Sorry?
Darwin was black-pilled.
I guess so, right?
Yeah.
So he considered the brain of a woman to be between that of a child and a savage. Okay? So that doesn't fit Rebecca Watson's view. Rebecca famously, you know, being somebody who believes in, you know, liberalism and Darwinism and these things, she was once wearing this famous shirt in one of the American elections, which was, you know, Darwin for president. Well, how can you say that when Darwin's been saying these types of things about women? So the feminists broke away, and then we also had the breakaway with the trans movement, right? Because evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biologists like Richard Dawkins, they would define a woman biologically. They would not accept her this gender fluidity. So people like Matt Dillahunty, who was a strong new atheist,
Yes.
he had a public split with Dawkins in which he basically told him to F off. And what was the argument about? It was something so petty, the way that it was put forward. You know, Dillahunty is saying, just because a woman has a penis doesn't mean she's a man. And from
just because a woman has a penis doesn't mean she can't menstruate. Some kind of, you know, logical.
And funnily enough, and I said this to, it's just one of those really bad incidents that he happened to be dating a trans woman at the time. So there's a vested interest that maybe calling out Dawkins because maybe he doesn't want to be associated with dating a man. I don't know. I don't know what it was. Yeah. But what does it go to show you? It goes to show you that liberal ideologies, the subsets of it like feminism, right, or humanism, they don't fit well with Darwinism. So this is one of the huge sociological splits of our times, the split between the feminists and the new atheists, and obviously later on with the trans movement.
Right. And we have influences from all of those individual movements in Pakistan. You get a little bit of Marxism, you get a little bit of... actually, we didn't end up talking about the relationship of Marxism and Darwinism. We never did. Huh. We get a lot of that. We get a lot of Marxist leftists, we get a lot of liberals, we get a lot of the gender and sex types. And they seem to get along for now in Pakistan. Although I can see the seams, I can already see where the fault lines are and potential splits. I mean, there's always a lag, like a cultural lag between the West and the third world. But what are the relationships between what is the relationship between the Marxists and Darwinism?
Well, what we often find, and this is something that's very hard to deny, what we often find is that followers of Marxism, although it may not be true in Pakistan, I don't know, the followers of Marxism are usually people grounded in a scientific worldview, not scientific, but scientific, as in followers of scientism. And they are people who would accept as the origin of morality some form of Darwinism, right? But the problem here is this. The problem is, how do you show that your Marxist ideals, how do you show that those are justified from a Darwinian framework? Now, what is the history of these Marxists in the 20th century? What we find is that they are applying Darwinian selectionist principles at a social class level. That is exactly what was happening in the Soviet Union. So they try and show that there's some form of, or they believe that they have a harmonious, coherent worldview, when their worldview is incoherent. Because if you want to say, we believe in women's rights, we believe in this, the state should not, the state should own these public institutions, or we believe in this, or we believe in that. How do you marry that, square that with your Darwinian perspective? Like something David Stove points out, although he's an atheist, although he himself is a Darwinist from the perspective that he believes that's the origin of mankind, he points out something. He says, we fund for the survival of the unfittest. We fund for the survival of the dying. We fund public education for people that we're not related to. None of this makes any Darwinian sense. Maybe it's helpful here if I break down some basic Darwinian theories. Something that Darwin found very hard to explain was the behavior of insects. Now, the behavior of insects is altruistic. They do not look out for themselves, they look out for the colony. They look out for the queen. They're willing to die for the sake of the colony. They are willing not to have, they don't have children, and they let the queen have children, and they are there as simply extensions of her will, her government, if you like. None of that fits the selfish gene idea. None of that fits the selfish organism idea. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you be selfish? So Darwin considered this a special problem. That's what he called it, a special problem. So there was no answer to this problem. Somebody by the name of W.D. Hamilton, they came up with a solution. And the solution was that of inclusive fitness. So you, me, we all have brothers and sisters. Our brothers and sisters share our genetics. So if I am willing to die for the sake of a couple of brothers, some cousins, they all carry my genetics, I'm actually propagating my genetics in the next generation because I'm protecting them. So the idea was this: kin selection is the idea that you help your sisters or your brothers or other relatives, you die to protect them, not because you love them, not because you care for them, only because you want your genetics to be passed on to the next generation. Okay. The second idea is reciprocal altruism. I'm nice to you, not because I want to be nice to you. I'm nice to you because you're going to help my reproductive fitness. Now, within this podcast context, I don't understand how that will happen, but like just a general idea, okay? So a reproductive fitness enhancing behavior can be attained by reciprocation, okay? The problem with kin selection and reciprocal altruism, as David Stove points out, it doesn't apply to you helping a stranger who you'll never meet. You're giving money for some poor person in the Philippines, which you'll never meet. They'll never help you out reciprocally, and they're not related to you from a kin selection.
When you see someone on the motorway and their tire has gone out and you stop and help them and then you leave and never see that human being again.
The other way that they try and explain it is this. This is a really ridiculous idea, but I want you to stick to the logic here. In the past, we used to live in tribes. So the person next to you was most likely your brother or your sister or your cousin. Natural selection programmed us to be nice to our kin. The kin were normally close to us. So an evolutionary byproduct
is that physical proximity.
Physical proximity, but that physical proximity is no longer relevant due to urbanization.
Right.
So what they say is, you're good to your neighbor when you've moved to Islamabad as opposed to you living in a village in Murray, because your evolutionary heritage makes you think that that person is related to you.
Because they're your kinsmen because of physical proximity.
Yeah. The problem with this nonsense is nobody wants to accept that. Nobody wants to believe that. So what we have with the Marxists is they don't want to accept religion. Religion is the opiate of the masses. But they want to believe in these egalitarian values. But those egalitarian values do not match the only thing that's giving them a shred of explanation for morality. And this is something which I would highly recommend those who are critics of Marxism look into more and put to them. Because look, the way I would put it is this: the vast majority of Marxists have never gone that far. It's almost like this. It's almost like they're at the coast and they're swimming with us and they're whatever, and we want to take them a bit further to the sea and they're like, I don't have the ability to swim.
So you think that it is a lack of critical inquiry into the tradition of Marxism and not seeing the links between Marxism and Darwinism, and then the self-evident contradictions of how do you ground a moral system for collective good in any sort of Marxist, any sort of Darwinian or atheistic worldview? Because there's no point then, is there? And the kin selection theory seems kind of tenuous when you say, okay, physical proximity to people will trigger some sort of kinsman response.
Absolutely. Let's break it down to race. Marxists are big on that. You know, the Black Lives Movement, just generally
a lot of the Marxist language has shifted the goalpost from political economic goals to social justice goals.
Yes.
A lot to do with gender, sex, race, minorities, marginalized groups.
So let's look at race. Darwin believed that the highest man, the highest category of the highest evolved creature in terms of the human races was the white man. He didn't just believe that the white were at the top and the black were right at the bottom. And what we find with Ernst Haeckel, his contemporary in Germany, is he had this helpful image where he had, the Caucasian man slowly, then the Chinese, then like the Indian, and then like the African. Right next to the African was the ape, right? So the chimpanzee. So what we find is that Darwin not only believed that the Caucasian were the superior race, he believed that Victorian England, he believed the English to be superior to the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French and others. Now, what was the justification that he had?
It was the cuisine, wasn't it?
It was actually something a little bit more civilized than that. And it was the ability of Britain to colonize the rest of the world in a more effective way than the other European civilizations. Now, I want you to consider something. The Portuguese are white. The English are white. Who did better colonization, the English or the Portuguese? What did the Portuguese do? They took slaves from Western Africa. They took them to places like Brazil. Many of them died in terrible conditions. Eventually, they had to let go of the colonies. They were not as successful in terms of landmass, economics, politics, all of these things. Yet, from every metric, from finance to sociological markers, British imperialists, colonization was far more effective, far more optimized than the Portuguese. That was evidence for Darwin that the English are far superior. Now, when we have these Darwinists, right? When we have these, Marxists, and these Marxists are talking about, okay, we believe in this, we believe in this, we believe in, Black Lives Matter, we believe in all of these types of things, these types of egalitarian values. How do you marry that with the so-called facts about human races, human evolution that we have in terms of other people being far lower? In fact, even today, the co-discoverer of the double helix structure, Jim Watson, alongside Francis Collins, they won the Nobel Prize in the 1950s or 60s with their discovery of, the so-called secret of life. Francis Collins passed away. I want everybody to Google this. What does his co-founder, Jim Watson, believe about race? What does he believe about black people? Where do those beliefs come from? Is it just him being an old racist white man? Or is it the case that he pins it down to biology? Look at what Yuval Noah Harari actually says in his book, Sapiens, which funnily enough is a darling book for the Marxists. What does he actually say about the racist theories which were being churned out in the early 20th century? He says that those theories were being pushed out by scientific academics. It wasn't, and also he says something very interesting, and maybe this is an interesting point to elaborate upon. He said the death of those scientific racist theories which were based on Darwinism, the death of those theories came due to what the Nazis did. Not due to new scientific findings. It was due to what the Nazis did. Now, obviously, I don't believe in any of those things. But what do we find today? We find today a resurgence of that white nationalism, that white type of the pseudo-scientific supremacy. And we find people trying to revive that in a political context like Nick Fuentes. It's coming back again, right?
Yeah.
And you'll also find some people who are again misusing the mantle of science, misusing evolutionary theory to push white supremacism.
Okay, the white supremacy is back, and Marxism has its roots in that sort of Darwinian white supremacy. But the modern Marxist is so divorced from that tradition now that they would find these things abhorrent. Couldn't the Marxists then just simply divorce these ideas and find their moral grounding in something else other than Darwinism or social Darwinism? Wouldn't that be a possibility for them?
They can, of course, do that.
And I think they have, by the way.
No, they can, of course, do that. But then they would have to give up some of the core ideas of the Marxists. So Marxists, when they came to power, they applied state atheism. And state atheism is something they enforced. And millions of people were persecuted. And we had the death of so many clergymen and imams and rabbis. And you had wholesale destruction of religion. That type of state atheism is because they fundamentally believe in naturalism. But if they believe in naturalism and they want to give up the Darwinian ugly picture, then if they're looking for something else, then they are no longer naturalists. And that's the problem. If they give up naturalism, then are they really Marxists? And what I find strange is that in places like Pakistan, Marxists would use Islamic language, and they would try to make this almost Islamic socialist argument. But the problem with that is it's fundamentally incoherent. It's no different to the so-called Islamic feminists who are using a bit of Islam, a bit of feminism, and just having a little muta, right? And just trying to explain that to people. But it's fun. Anybody can see the actual flaws with that.
Right. Lots of questions to be answered still. Subboor bhai, you've given us a lot of your time, and it's getting quite late in the day. If you guys enjoyed this discussion, please leave your questions down below for what you would like us to discuss with Subboor bhai next time he's around Pakistan or over Zoom or something, inshallah. If you guys would like to see Subboor's work, you can just follow him online anywhere, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, wherever you find people, he's there, inshallah. And Subboor bhai, is there a message that you would like to give to the audience before we sort of cap this discussion?
We've discussed a lot of ideas. We've discussed, things till the cows come home. And it's around the time that cows come home.
Yes.
I just want to end with one simple statement, which is something I've mentioned previously and I'll mention once more. In the natural selection of ideas, the truth will always be selected because it's in line with human nature. And the truth of Tawheed is something which will break through all of the noise.
Inshallah, it's inevitable. And we all hope that we can add something to that effort. Thank you, Subboor bhai. Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.